I'm going to be speaking on trauma and hopeful living. And I just want to give you a little bit of background of how I got into mental health. I graduated from the University of Waterloo in recreation, and I had the honor and privilege of working in the Jane Finch area of Toronto. I don't know if you're familiar with the Jane Finch area, but it is a high needs area. And after a year, I thought, I don't want to be doing managing of a rec center. I actually want to help some of these kids. And so that was my lead way into going back to school to become a social worker, and ended up in Mississauga, and then eventually came back to the KW area, which is where I am from. And this morning, we talked a... Oop. Did I do something? Okay, are we back? Yeah. So I don't know why each of you came today. I don't know your stories or the circumstances, but you're here for a reason. Today may be triggering for you, I'm not sure, but here are some suggestions. I want you to be aware of what's happening in your body. Discomfort is okay. Maybe do a little bit of grounding, and what that means maybe is to take a few deep breaths. Maybe just rub your hands together or open your hands, relax your shoulders, those types of things. If you do notice a physical reaction or some discomfort, just be curious. Where is it coming from? Why is it coming up? And learning to tolerate that discomfort. Today is not about blaming other people. It's not about blaming parents or grandparents. It's about having a better understanding of why we function the way we function. This is a quote from Gabor Mate, and Gabor Mate was a family physician for many years and got into the work of addictions, and has a practice out in Vancouver, and now works exclusively with basically trauma and the impact on the body. And this is a quote from him. "Health and illness are not random states in a body. They are an expression of an entire life lived, one that cannot be understood in isolation. It is influenced by a web of our circumstances, our relationships, our events, and our experiences." We don't have to be a war vet, be in a refugee camp, or flee from abuse in order to encounter trauma. Trauma happens to us, it happens to our friends, our families, and our neighbors. Research from the Center for Disease Control and Prevention has released the following stats. This is out of the States, but they are very similar to Canadian stats. 1 in 5 Americans were sexually molested as a child. 1 in 4 were beaten by a parent to the point where there was a mark left on their body. 1 in 3 couples engages in physical violence. 25% of people grew up with an alcoholic relative. 1 in 8 have witnessed their mothers being hit or beat. It leaves traces on our minds and our emotions, on our capacity for joy and intimacy, and even on our biology and our immune systems. It not only impacts the person that has been through the trauma, but also their families and those closest to them. The Greek, trauma comes from the Greek word, it's a Greek origin, and it means wound. Our woundedness, or how we cope with trauma, dictates much of our behavior, shapes our social habits, and informs our way of thinking. When a wound doesn't mend, it either stays raw or it is replaced by a thick layer of scar tissue. So thinking about that from a mental health perspective, it either remains raw or it's replaced by a thick layer of scar tissue. Another quote from Gabor Mate, "Trauma is not what happens to you, it's what happens inside of you as a result of what happens to you. The event itself may not be the best predictor of how we respond or cope." What I mean by that is people can go through the same experience, however, we respond very differently. And that's because of the experiences that we've been through up to that point in time may be very different. There's 2 types of trauma. One is what we call the capital T trauma. That's our bigger traumatic injuries, our natural disasters, plane crashes, war, abuse. It involves threat to life or a perceived threat to life. A small t trauma, that can include things like a breakup, a loss of a pet or a relationship, a job loss. death of a parent or a relative. It's non-life threatening. What can trauma look like? When a traumatic event occurs, our automatic danger signals are disturbed and become either hyper or hypo-aroused. And we will unpack that a little bit as we go. So I want you to think about, and this was an example last night actually, if you were to walk into a jungle and you see a lion, your automatic nervous system gets activated. Your heart rate increases, your blood pressure increases, maybe you get butterflies in your stomach, your palms get sweaty. Each of those things is there to help you survive that moment. It's either to help you outrun that lion or to stay and fight that lion. So it's doing exactly what it needs to for survival. Or we can end up in the hypo-aroused, that freeze state. Thinking about it, if there's an intruder in your home, we become kind of, we want to slow our heart rate down. We want to become withdrawn. We want to become almost invisible, shut down, disconnected. Separated from self, feelings or emotions, right? That's how we're going to survive that moment. Make ourselves kind of as invisible or as small as possible. So once again, our body is doing exactly what it needs to survive that moment. So we have what's called functional anxiety and dysfunctional anxiety. So functional anxiety is that anxiety that happens in those moments when we need it for survival. But then what happens is our alarm systems sometimes keep going when there's not a threat. That's the dysfunctional anxiety. So when we talk about anxiety, quite often we're referring to that dysfunctional anxiety, because I can tell you if you're in the jungle and you saw a lion, you wouldn't be, oh my gosh, my heart rate is going up. You would know exactly, it's giving you exactly what you need to do. You're not thinking about how uncomfortable that feeling is, because that's not the focus. If we have a dysfunctional anxiety, or almost like if we have panic attacks, which can be that flooding of that hyper-aroused state. Typically, a panic attack would resolve in 20 to 30 minutes. The reason being is, thinking back to the lion in the jungle, if you haven't figured out how to get safe in 20 to 30 minutes, it's not going to end well, right? And so your body gives you exactly what you need for the time that you need it, and then eventually it will come back. So if you do struggle with panic attacks, remind yourself, it's uncomfortable, it's not dangerous. What can I do to ground myself? Let me get a hold of my breath. Maybe run my hands under some warm water. Maybe getting outside into nature. Something to learn to tolerate that for a little bit longer. As much as we want that panic attack to go away, really that flood of adrenaline is going to keep going until it naturally resolves. The challenge is if we say, oh my gosh, I'm having a panic attack, then the body's like, oh my gosh, I'm going to give you more adrenaline, right? So don't feed into it. Be kind of like, okay, 20 to 30 minutes, it will resolve, I'm okay. I'm uncomfortable, but I'm not in danger. So it's learning to tolerate that. If you can put the first slide up. Oh, the other first slide, that one. This is called the window of tolerance. So the window of tolerance, when you look at that yellow square in the middle, that's our comfort zone. That's where we feel good. We're calm, we're cool, collected, we're self-regulated, we can self-soothe, we feel good. However, there are things that cause us to go out of that comfort zone. So if you look at the box on the left, what causes us to go out of our comfort zone? Fear. Fear of maybe our unconscious thoughts, maybe fear of what's happening to our body, maybe a loss of control, feeling unsafe, feeling like there's a lack of existence or abandonment or rejection. Those types of things kind of cause us to go either into the hyper-aroused state at the top or the freeze response, the hypo-aroused at the bottom. So the hyper-aroused, that's our anxiety. We're feeling overwhelmed. Maybe some anger, some aggression, some rage, rigid, OCD symptoms, those types of things. So it can cause us to go hyper, or it can lead us into that freeze response that we talked about, that disassociation, that shutdown, feeling not present, that sort of thing, disconnected. How do we get back into the comfort zone? How do we get back into that yellow box? Lots of different things. Talk about the mindfulness piece. How do we become present in the here and now? Grounding exercises, which we've talked about. Deep breathing. Power of prayer. Power of being present. Maybe being with people who are supportive can help us to get back into that window of tolerance. So the challenge with the window of tolerance. If we've been through trauma, our window of tolerance gets squished. It's so much easier for us to get out of it, right? It could be an exam, all of a sudden we're dysregulated. It could be someone cuts us off, we're dysregulated. Someone gets upset with us, we're dysregulated. So quite often, our goal is to how do we expand that comfort zone so that we can learn to tolerate more. So yeah, not doing well on a test or an exam, okay, that's uncomfortable, but it's not going to throw me off, right? So trying to expand that comfort zone. After we've been through a trauma and we are back to the point of safety, so we're talking about kind of that functional anxiety or that functional piece. We've been through a trauma and we are back to this point of safety. Our nervous system, our automatic nervous system, in an ideal world will return back to our baseline as well. So we think about that baseline anxiety. It's kind of back to maybe that 2 or 3 out of 10. There may be a period of time where the body needs to adjust or adapt before it gets back to that. It could be a couple of hours, it could be a few days. I think about my daughter's friend. She was in a car accident last summer and it really threw her off, and so she was having what she described as PTSD symptoms. I'm having nightmares, I can't sleep, I can't focus, all of those things. And so there's a period of time where that's a normal reaction, right? You know, and for her it was probably about 4 or 5 days before her sleep started to regulate again, and that's okay. It's kind of when it goes on for weeks and weeks and months that's the PTSD piece. That's where our brain gets stuck. If our brain gets stuck and it's trying to fix this trauma, that's where the PTSD may come in. What does PTSD look like? So PTSD stands for post-traumatic stress disorder. That could be flashbacks. I'm thinking about the trauma. When I close my eyes at night, I'm reliving that trauma. It could be that hypervigilance. Extreme sensitivity to light or sound, that startle response. Inability to cope with stressors that we normally have been able to cope with. Difficulty sleeping or nightmares. The challenge with the sleep piece is, excuse me, it's the last thing to correct, because throughout the day, when we've been through trauma or whatever, we can kind of keep ourselves occupied and distracted, but at night, anything that we worry about all of a sudden comes back to the surface. It's taken priority because we're not there to shut it down. And so people often ask, well, how do I get rid of that piece? That's a symptom of the anxiety still being there, and that should hopefully, as we do more of the work during the conscious hours, that will start to subside and reduce as well. Panic attacks and anxiety are a symptom of PTSD, depression, feelings of detachment, maybe psychosomatic illness, headaches, migraines, chronic pain, digestive problems. Instead of asking what's wrong with me, we want to ask the question, what happened to me? Why is my body doing this? As I described earlier today, many of those symptoms are basically the body's coping strategy to deal with the trauma that it has experienced, whether that is a developmental trauma, which we'll unpack a little bit, or a single session of trauma, single episode of trauma. So we're going to talk about 3 types of trauma. One is shock trauma, one is the developmental trauma, and one is transgenerational trauma. What is shock trauma? That's where we feel overwhelmed by a single event. The event is usually sudden and unexpected, with a distinct beginning and an end, and is over relatively quickly. It interrupts our flow of life, and we feel we are frozen in the event. As a result, you feel like your world has shattered, and your sense of safety has been broken. It can include falls, accidents, assault, near drowning, natural disasters, or invasive medical procedures. It can occur in adults or children who have been part of the trauma or who have witnessed it. When I think back to 9/11, they had interviewed some students, grade 5 students. No, I think they were grade 5 students who were watching it on CNN. It seemed to be on everyone's television for weeks on end. And what the students couldn't understand is, why on earth are all of those planes flying into all of those buildings? Overwhelming for the system. They weren't able to recognize, no, it's a replay, it's repeat. And so a lot of people struggled with nightmares and PTSD symptoms as a result of witnessing that. A traumatic response is a normal result to a disturbing event. And like I said earlier, it becomes PTSD when our system gets stuck and the body recognizes it or perceives it as the threat is still present. So it's trying to figure out how do we take this trauma and our brain recognize it at some point that it becomes a historical event where we can talk about that event, still emotional, but our body doesn't respond as if it's currently happening to us. I'm going to share a story about my good friends Jamie and Katrina and a shock trauma that they had went through, and it was July of 2000. Jamie was a pastor, still is, at a church in Brampton, North Bramalea. Him and his wife had a 2-year-old and a 5-week-old at the time, and they were taking their children and they were going with their youth group out to Pine Lakes, Alberta for a Habitat for Humanity build. And they did the build, and the youth group came back, and a lot of the staff came back. Jamie and Katrina stayed on longer to visit with some friends in the campground. They had done their daily devotion that night at dinner, and I'm going to read what their devotion was. It's Romans 8:38 and 39. For I am convinced that neither death nor life, neither angels nor demons, neither the present nor the future, or any powers, neither height nor depth, nor anything else in all creation will be able to separate us from the love of God that is Christ Jesus our Lord. They'd done their devotions that night. They were staying with one couple and their 1-year-old son. After dinner, they went outside. It was a beautiful night. Then all of a sudden it started hailing, and the hail was quite big. And then they realized, oh my gosh, something's shifting. We need to go back inside. And so they went back inside, and half kind of laid on the floor on one side of the bed, and half were on the other side of the bed. And an F4 tornado came through, hit their trailer. It all went up. They couldn't find Lucas. Lucas was 2. Katrina and Leah were on the other side of the bed, and they were okay, just some bumps and scratches and that sort of thing. But the trailer was gone, and they had to go find Lucas. They found Lucas about 100 meters away, and they knew he hadn't made it. They took him to the ambulance, put him in the back of the ambulance, and Jamie was just physically ill. He was throwing up. His life had been shattered. This was a trauma. Katrina went over to him and said, remember what we read. She will confess she doesn't know if it was a question or if she was leaning into it, but that was the first thing that came to her mind, is nothing can separate us from God's love. Nothing can separate Lucas from God's love. So over the coming weeks, God showed up in miraculous ways for them. From the nurse who came to the hospital, so when they went to the hospital that night, they all needed stitches. There was a nurse that was working that night. She came back the next day with a diaper bag, with some supplies, with $100 in cash, and they've maintained this friendship actually for 23 years with her, because she was just God's hands and feet in that moment. There was a rainbow that shone over their house that night, and the rainbow became very symbolic for their family as it showed up many, many times. They came home, they did the funeral that week. And I remember actually at the funeral there was the book, Why Do Bad Things Happen to Good People? That book was floating around. We saw several copies of it. And Jamie went on months later to do a message on, that's not the question. The question is, what do good people do when bad things happen? And so his response as time went on really went on, and I'll share a little bit about that. But the following week they went back out to Pine Lake, Alberta, just to kind of get their heads around what had happened with their family. The rainbow was there. Same time, there's a rainbow over their house, right? The recognition that God is with us in the storm, an everlasting covenant between man and God. The next 5 weeks, they went to 5 different churches. They weren't telling people what church they were going to. He was taking a break from pastoring. He just needed to, work through a lot of things. So they would always show up at different churches late. They would leave early, never tell anyone where they were going. And guess what scripture was read 4 of those 5 weeks? Nothing can separate us from God's love. I don't know about your church, but that church, or that verse doesn't show up very often in our church, maybe at funerals, but it was this reminder that, God is telling us he is with us. people donated money for Lucas, and they're like, what do we do with this? And so what they ended up doing was they had a carnival to celebrate, the gift of life. And every year they honored another family who had lost a child. And every year they were able to journey with another family through Christ's love for them over the next, up until COVID, 20 years. It became one of Brampton's signature events, the most popular, well-attended event in the city of Brampton, with 5,000 people each year. Free event in order to help people celebrate what God has given us. And so, really powerful how God has shown up with all of that. As I said earlier today, our brains are not designed to go from one tragedy to another. We're not designed to see the George Floyds, the school shootings. When we see those tragedies and the headlines, we are filled with fear, dread, thoughts that the world is a dangerous place. What we don't see is how God shows up. Interesting, we have some people from our church that are living in the Czech Republic, and as we all witnessed kind of what was happening in Ukraine, it was interesting to kind of see some of their posts about what's happening on the ground to help those people and how God is showing up in that situation as well. Once again, we don't see that. It's not reported in the news. So that's a shock trauma. That is something that is life-changing, life-altering, but God can do so much work in that. The next one I'm going to talk about is a developmental trauma. And it's the term that we use to describe the impact of early, repeated trauma and loss, which happens within our child's important relationships early in life. It can include neglect, prenatal, what's going on for mom, and what is she going through, or perinatal trauma, loss of a significant person during the early childhood years, physical, sexual, or emotional abuse. It can be intentional, it can be unintentional. When I think about moms who maybe it was a surprise pregnancy, they don't have the financial resources, they're a single parent, all of those different things, and what does that stress do to that infant as it's developing? When an infant's needs are met, they can go into the world with a sense of safety, curiosity, and engagement. They learn that they can impact their environment. When they cry, someone picks them up. When they're hungry, someone feeds them. When they're distressed, someone can soothe them. They also can become aware, and they learn that some of the outcomes are in fact outside of their control. I have a wet diaper, but it's not changed right away, right? So sometimes they don't always have complete control, but their needs are being met. If there is abuse, neglect, or loss, whether it's intentional or unintentional, it impairs how a child bonds or attaches to their caretaker, and they learn that their needs may not always be met, which as they grow older, they learn that the world may not be safe. We talk about this term locus of control, the degree to which people, which starts out in infancy, believe that they have control over the outcomes of their lives. For infants, the locus of control is always external. They are dependent on someone to feed them, change their diapers, soothe them, and meet their needs, as we've said. Developmental trauma occurs when we are dependent on our caregivers, and when our needs are met. When our needs are not met, it impacts our attachment. We hear a lot about the term attachment, and we start to learn that our caregivers may hurt us as well. Therefore, our automatic nervous system becomes activated and heightened because now they need to become dependent on that nervous system to protect them because the caregiver is not. When many people with early developmental trauma learn that they can't necessarily impact their environment if their needs are not being met, and therefore are further along that continuum towards what's called the external locus of control, sometimes feeling victimized by the outside world. So as they grow up, so if you've been through some childhood trauma, sometimes we perceive people as threatening, whether it's the police, whether it's the government, whether it's teachers. We're like, that's a threat to me because you're part of that outside world, which because of the trauma during that early infancy, they recognize that that is also threatening, right? Because nothing is safe for me. For a child who grows up in the perfect family, not that I think that that exists, it doesn't exist. It starts out as an external locus of control. Our needs are being met. However, as they feel safe, they become more confident, and it transitions to more of an internal locus of control. They realize that they can impact the world. And we're all somewhere on this continuum between an internal and an external locus of control. So internal locus of control, what does that look like? Have a sense of confidence when challenged or confronted, typically healthier physically, strong sense of self-efficacy, able to set goals and work towards them, reports being happier, appreciates independence, and works better at their own pace. For those with an external locus of control, meaning my needs haven't been met, they often grow up to be ones that blame others for their circumstances. Quick to give credit to others, or luck or circumstances. Sense of powerlessness, believes that he doesn't necessarily have the ability to change circumstances, often feels helpless, that learned helplessness. When we've been through trauma, what ends up happening is we now need to learn our defensive accommodations. We develop survival strategies. When we learn that we're not able to control or influence our environment is perceived as threatening, those defensive mechanisms will arise. Developmental trauma can make it seem like even the most basic needs, like being cared for and nurtured, are outside of a normal experience. When infants and children do not receive this nurturing, they may grow up to believe that they don't deserve it or they are not worthy of it. As we talked about with the window of tolerance, the two primary responses to developmental trauma in children are hyperarousal or hypoarousal. That's shut down. Think about words like oppositional. We think about words defiant, distant, acting out, resistant, are often used to describe the fearful adult or child. Defensive mechanisms are driven by a need to survive and a lack of self-regulation. They often describe feeling out of control in their own body, big feelings, right? Because that nervous response or that automatic nervous system is so activated and heightened. Other defensive accommodations, self-harm, eating disorders, compulsive behaviors, anything that can help substitute for regulation. They're looking for ways to regulate, or anything that helps to support a sense of control, safety, or connection. So I'm going to share an example of someone that I was working with at one point. This is a girl who struggled with anxiety throughout her life, didn't want to go to kindergarten. She was the one that would cry when it was time for her to go in. Teachers always asked, "What's wrong? What's wrong?" Never really figured it out. Had some assessments done, but they hadn't quite figured it out. Coped well throughout her 20s, very well in her career. She thrived, living in a fast pace, always on the go, because I think she thrived in that heightened state. She had a panic attack on the bus, but she felt well supported. It wasn't traumatic. COVID hit. She came home. She had a traumatic incident with her sister. It ended up with her being hospitalized for a mental health crisis. She developed agoraphobia, not wanting to leave the house. And so I was meeting with her and her mom, because she wouldn't come in without her mom. And we asked about a trauma history. And she's like, "No, I can't think of any trauma history." But then her mom also talked about, shared about an increased sensitivity to light and an increased sensitivity to touch. And my thinking brain got activated, and I'm like, "Was she born prematurely?" She's like, "What do you mean? What does that have to do with it?" Yes, she was. So if you think about an infant born prematurely, an infant born kind of full term and an uneventful birth, they're picked up by mom or parent, they're soothed, they're fed, comfort from food, comfort from a heartbeat from that rocking. You think about an infant that's in an incubator for 2, 4, 6 weeks. There's a lot of lights, there's a lot of sound, there's a lot of poking with a needle, pricking with the heel, shoving a tube up your nose, all of those things. And so that infant becomes so reactive that seems threatening, and so now their system is heightened. It was interesting because I had a daughter that was born at 30 weeks after a very challenging pregnancy. And my wheels were turning because I'm like, "Oh my gosh, this is what we experience." This sense that she's always saying, "Why is everyone yelling?" "No one's yelling, Michaela." Very sensitive to pain, very struggles emotionally to kind of regulate, all of those things. But it's from this developmental trauma that happened through her birth. And that's really what I mean when we talk about some of these unintentional developmental traumas. right? That's no one's fault. There's no one to blame for that. That's just the biology and the automatic nervous system trying to help this infant survive in this environment that feels very unsafe and uncomfortable. A child's nervous system until the age of 2 does not have the capacity to self-soothe. They must rely on a caretaker to guide them to a calmer state. If the caretaker is unable to do so because they're dysregulated, frequently angry, anxious, or depressed, and I actually see, one of the things that I worry more is when I go to Walmart and I see babies or young kids crying in the cart and mom's on the phone. Mom's absent, right? Mom's not meeting that needs. That can create that dysregulation as well. The child's brain may not develop as well as it should. And therefore, a child grows up with a decreased capacity to control their own emotions and behaviors. As an adult, that child has adapted by avoiding situations that evoke strong emotions or may act impulsively. This can lead to social isolation, frequent conflict with others, depression, anxiety, or some other challenge from a mental health perspective. Typically, our trauma response, if there's something that triggers us, and we'll talk a little bit about triggers, is based on the age that we were when the initial trauma occurred. So for example, if a 6-year-old child experienced abuse or abandonment, our way of coping or managing may have been to hide or fight back. As an adult, when we face that trigger, we may avoid difficult situations, or we may argue or become enraged, because that's kind of what our brain did at that point to survive. So the brain remembers what it had to do to survive then, and it will do the same now. For individuals who experience birth trauma or premature births, their bodies are often anxious and dysregulated, making it difficult to tolerate even minor distressing events, such as exams, fender benders, someone gets upset with them. Like I said, our response that helped us survive in that moment is what we default to as adults. Think about the times when you've seen road rage. Someone yells at an employee at a store or a restaurant. My favorite, when a parent yells at a ref. All of our kids have played hockey, and I was watching a game a few months ago, and my youngest, single A hockey, like they're not going to the NHL, it's just they're out there to have fun. And it wasn't even a playoff game, and the ref called a penalty with 2 minutes left against their team, and this parent was losing it. And I just remember thinking, that is a trauma response. This ref made a call that triggered a sense of powerlessness in him. I don't think he was angry at the ref, but it was just this automatic physiological response that developed inside of him that's what guided that behavior in that moment. And we're going to talk about when that physiological response happens, how our thinking brain kind of gets disconnected in that moment. But it also goes back to this yellow box. I think it was compressed there because a call in a hockey game probably shouldn't cause someone to become hyper-aroused. But it did in that moment, and that's where it's kind of like, okay, something else is going on here. When we see that, when we see someone in front of us who is acting like that, how do we get impacted? Our automatic nervous reaction is also to get heightened, right? And now they're dysregulated, and we're dysregulated, and really what we want to try and do is be like, okay, how do I co-regulate them? They're upset. Think about a family dinner or a function like that, and someone else is getting upset. It's like, okay, how do I maintain my peace and maybe help support them, as opposed to kind of reacting to that? That is very difficult to do, but once you become aware of that, it's interesting to be able to do that. You often see that in a restaurant when someone gets upset and the waiter or whoever is like, how can I help you? Here, let me try and make this right. Learning that ability to help co-regulate someone else is a skill. Here's an example I'm going to share that I just became aware of about 2 weeks ago. My husband says this in a lovingly way. Sometimes every now and then he calls me by my name, Melody Jane, and oh, does it irk me. Why does it irk me? Who calls someone by their first full name and middle name? Usually an upset parent. My defensive reaction, right? I don't ever remember my parents doing that, but I could tell internally I'm reacting to that, so my body remembers that. And so we've had a few conversations. Please do not call me that. It makes me uncomfortable. But that's the body remembering, right? The body remembers what has happened in our childhood that maybe our brains do not remember. And I'm going to come back to that when I talk about the brain in a few minutes. Third one I want to go on to is what we call a generational or a transgenerational trauma. This refers to the trauma, and it may sound kind of like, what do you mean? It gets passed down through the generations. Not only can someone experience trauma, but they can actually pass down some of those symptoms and behaviors of their trauma survival onto their children, who might further pass this along the family line. Thinking about alcohol or child abuse, sometimes that goes many generations. Scientists have found that mothers who have suffered from childhood trauma can pass this memory down onto an unborn child. Scans show that there is an altered brain circuitry in young children. We see this with racism, we see this with poverty, we see this in our indigenous communities, people who have endured wars, devastating natural disasters like the 2004 tsunami. Their children and their grandchildren are impacted by that trauma that they have been through. How does it present? Hypervigilance, a sense of a shortened future, some mistrust, high anxiety and depression, panic attacks, nightmares, insomnia, the fight or flight response. I was working with someone who, when she was in her teen years, her parents moved her and her sibling from Kosovo to Macedonia because there was an impending war. And so she was separated from her family for 2 months, as the remainder of her family stayed in Kosovo until they were able to get out. No communication, and she was uncertain if her family was safe. They met up in a refugee camp where they remained for an additional 2 months before they got approval to come to Canada. She was under severe stress, abandonment, and trauma. She has since had several children of her own, all of whom have been born prematurely, and all have some unusual physical presentations and challenges that her children are now facing, that have now had many surgeries in their childhood. Because she had been separated from her parents, she has put additional stress on herself to be the perfect parent and to meet all of her children's needs. She struggles with severe stress and worry if she cannot meet all of their needs. It's like this overcompensation. She feels the need to have a perfect home. Every room is spotless. The thing that was really interesting to me is she gets together with her parents and her siblings and all the children like every day. And they're all adults with their own families. And it's just this separation caused this immense fear. And so, and it's wonderful that they spend time together, but I think it's born out of that. We were separated, and that was very traumatic for us. I'm going to go back to PTSD for a few minutes. We're going to talk about the risk factors of PTSD. Risk factors before a trauma. So there's risk factors that happen long before the trauma. Being female puts us at a heightened risk of PTSD. Being part of a marginalized community, previous traumatic experiences, history of abuse, pre-existing mental health challenges, history of substance abuse, poor coping skills, lack of social support. What is the risk factors during the trauma? If there's a threat to life, or believing you will die, being seriously injured, or feeling very helpless. What are the risk factors after the trauma? Little or no support after the event, or additional life stresses like job loss or divorce. The risk of PTSD has little to do with what the trauma is and more to do with the piece before and after. Factors that can promote recovery after trauma. Seeking support from other people such as friends and family, our church community, our small groups, prayer, finding a support group. Learning to feel good about our own actions within the face of danger. I was working with a woman once who, she was raped at gunpoint. She'd gotten a ride home with someone, and then she went in because he had to give her something, and her 9-year-old was in the car. And so while they were inside, she was raped at gunpoint. And so she was seeing me, and she was just so upset with herself and so ashamed because she didn't fight back. And I said to her, well, what would have happened if he fought back? What would he have done to you? What about your child? Your body did exactly what it needed to survive in that moment. So this idea of reframing that story, when we can look at it through a different lens, sometimes it can impact our recovery from that trauma. So learning to feel good about our actions within that event. I want to talk a little bit about the anatomy of the brain. So if you think about, this is my hand, but really it's going to be my brain. This is our brainstem, okay? This is, all those things that the brainstem is responsible for, breathing, heart rate, all the rest of it. This is our amygdala. It's this thing in here. It's in the center of our brain. It's our fire alarm. It's our smoke alarm. It's the one that tells us when there's threat or danger. And then we have this thinking brain. This is the rest of our brain that allows us to think, right? Because the amygdala, this part here, is the brain smoke detector, it will set off a series of alarms that prepare us to defend ourselves, right? And what it does is it causes this part, the thinking brain, to disconnect. So if you see a burning building, your thinking brain is like, okay, it's disengaged because you don't have time to think. Your amygdala is telling you, fight or flight. You need to either outrun or you need to do something. So your thinking brain kind of disconnects. So that's where we get this term, flip the lid, because the amygdala is heightened in this moment. It disengages so we can act instinctively. When we are exposed to trauma triggers or a similar experience happens, right? The brain has difficulty recognizing if it is a real threat or a trauma-related cue. That can include a sound, a sight, a smell, or a temperature. All of a sudden, the amygdala gets activated and the lid flips. I was working with someone who used to be a bus driver, and no trauma history that she was aware of. And she was, I don't know how old she was, probably in her 50s at the time. And all of a sudden, someone came onto the bus that was wearing cologne. It was a trigger. She doesn't know what. All of a sudden, she's like, I don't know how I ended up at the mall, and I ended up on the floor in a fetal position. She somehow got the bus safe, full of people, and her body shut down, her thinking brain shut down, but the body did exactly what it needed to do. Still to this day, she knows that there was some abuse as a child, but has no memory of it, but that smell is what triggered her to start to try and uncover the layers of this trauma history for her. That's where we talk about the body keeps score. The body remembers, the brain doesn't have to. We often think about children or when children or young kids go through rough things, we think, oh, it doesn't matter, they won't remember. But the body remembers. They don't need to remember. The brain development doesn't have to be there, but this amygdala is fully developed at birth. So it remembers all sorts of things. It responds that way. In order to work through our trauma, we have to figure out, how do I wake up the thinking brain? In order to overcome that legacy of trauma, we have to engage the thinking brain and be aware of what happens physiologically to us, right? And that's where I said at the beginning, when you get that physiological response, be curious. Learn to tolerate it, because if it doesn't dysregulate us too much, we can activate that thinking brain and have a better understanding of what is going on for us. Why am I becoming triggered? The more this is working, the amygdala, the less this is working. So this is a balancing act. So it's kind of like, okay, this is getting a little bit fired up. Let me keep my thinking brain here. Let me learn how to settle that amygdala in order to learn to tolerate and sit in the moment and be curious. One of the things that's really important to recognize is the more we are curious, focused, and aware, the calmer our body can become, right? A felt sense that the trauma is over. It helps to recognize it when we're exposed to a trigger, and not to use that physiological response as a compass. When we've been through trauma, our physiological, as I said earlier, is ready to fight or flight because that's what it's used to, that's what it's grown up with, right? And so we have to learn to recognize that that can't be the compass. There's a score that they use called the ACE score. Interestingly enough, this was actually developed, I think they came out of 27,000 kids that they were studying, and all from a affluent community, not marginalized communities. And it links 10 types of childhood trauma with the adult onset of chronic disease, mental illness, and violence. So there's 10 kind of things, and then they kind of, for each point you get 1 point, and the higher the number of points, the more likely you're going to struggle with some of these things. So if we've been through physical, sexual, or emotional abuse, physical or emotional neglect, living with a family member who struggles with addiction, depression, or other mental health illness, or has been in prison, witnessing a mother's abuse, if we've been through divorce or separation. So for people who have 4 of those on the checklist, an ACE score of 4, alcoholism increases by 700%. Attempted suicide increases by 1,200%. Heart disease and cancer nearly double. People with high ACE scores have more marriages, more broken bones, more depression, more prescription drug use, and more obesity. It's interesting, in the church sometimes we look at people who struggle with these things and think, what's wrong with you? Once again, it's that question, what happened to you? Why is your body doing this? As I said earlier at lunch, before lunch at the panel, what is anxiety? It's the inability to live with uncertainty. How do we learn to cope with our triggers? How do we learn to cope with distressing situations? How do we learn to expand our comfort zone? And I often think about the importance of this preventative anxiety management. What are we doing on a day-to-day basis versus reactive? What am I doing in the moment when I get triggered? We talked earlier about that baseline anxiety. If our baseline anxiety, so as I said before, thinking of anxiety on a scale of 1 to 10, 1 is I'm feeling good all the time, I don't have anxiety. Something happens, we might get up to a 5 or 6. If we're sitting at baseline on a day-to-day basis and our baseline is 5 or 6, it doesn't take much to get into that 9 or 10 where we're feeling out of control or heightened. If baseline anxiety is heightened long-term, anxiety is meant to help us in the moment, but if it's heightened long-term, it can cause inflammation in our body, as well as impact our immune system. It can lead to things like depression, anxiety, mental health diagnoses, such as bipolar or borderline, chronic pain, fibromyalgia, MS, Lou Gehrig's disease, cardiac conditions, asthma, IBS, cancer, the list goes on. Right? Because that is inflammation in the body caused by that cortisol release. As we've talked about, how does our culture contribute to anxiety? I gave the example of George Floyd, right? I think we all felt like we watched that unfold. We did. And then it was the next one, and then it was the next one, then it was the school shooting. And we are not designed to go from crisis to crisis. We see that, and our body responds to that. As I said earlier, being informed versus being overwhelmed. We want to be aware of what's going on, but we don't. It was interesting. One day I was out for a walk. This was a few years ago, and I was walking the dog, and he's doing his business. I'm looking up, and the stars are gorgeous, and I thought, if I knew nothing other than what was going on in my own life, life is good. And I realized a lot of the stress that we carry is really things that are going on around us, not within our own. When we look at the life that Jesus lived and the traumas that he endured, he was an outcast. He faced public scrutiny and condemnation. He faced rejection from his friends at the time that he needed it the most, and judgment from people in power. Throughout the New Testament, he took time away from his disciples to be with God and pray. When we think about Jesus on the cross, we can be assured that he knows our trauma and pain really well. And he is with us when these things happen in our lives. Jesus can calm the storm around us, but he can also calm the storm within us. And that's where we need to invite God into our trauma and into our lives to kind of help us to release us from some of that. So when I think about post-traumatic growth, and that's not a term that we've heard a lot of, that's more kind of a term in the last few years, post-traumatic growth. Okay, that makes sense. That gives us a little bit of a platform to work from. It's learning to reframe the story, right? Quite often we blame ourselves for the circumstances that have happened to us, or we think we did something wrong. I've been working with someone who, she carries a lot of shame and guilt, and one of the things that she felt very shameful about, she learned that she was adopted. She's known that her whole life. And she said, I'm grateful I was adopted. It was a loving family, that sort of thing. And so It was a great childhood. But she recently learned about the story of her adoption, and that her mom was actually ran away from home and was groomed into the sex trade as a form of survival. And so she said to me, I carry so much shame. I am so embarrassed and ashamed that that's how I came into the world. And so, and then there's been a couple of other things, that have caused this shame for her. So I said to her, where does the shame come from for you? And she said, well, I was raised Catholic, and I was told by my mom that if I did something wrong, then God would punish me. And so one time when she was sick, she fell off her bike, and her mom said to her, well, what did you do yesterday? God's punishing you. So anything that's happened to her entire life, she believed it was because God was punishing her. That's where the shame came from her. God can do his best work, some of his best work in times of difficulty. So we need to be aware of that. Look for where God shows up in that. God created us to be resilient. We often see the resilience in others, but fail to see it in ourselves. That shame and blame piece, I think that can keep people stuck in their trauma. I was working with someone who's worked really hard for her mental health, and what I noticed with her is, you think about this timeline, she was focusing very little on the developmental trauma piece, huge on the shame and blame, and very little on her growth, her post-traumatic growth. And so we're even just trying to say, okay, how do we contain this shame and blame? I said, would you blame someone else if this was their story? Absolutely not. We would never blame someone else. We would never shame someone else. But when it comes to us, when it comes to our own story, quite often we carry that shame and blame. That's why Jesus died on the cross for us. We need to trust him to take some of that for us, to be like, okay, God, I need to give this to you because I know you can handle it, and I know that that's the gift that you've given to us. Can you put up the next slide? Sorry. Yep, this one. We often hear the term mindfulness, being present, and Kelly talked about this yesterday. This is my favorite image of mindful or mindful. How often are we the person on the left? Our mind is full. We're thinking about everything. The person on the right, they're going for a walk in the trees, and that's where their mind is. God wants us to be present with him. And if we can spend part of our day, even 5 minutes, in that space, what a gift that is. We're in a very busy culture. Go, go, go. I was amazed the other day. I thought I had the notifications turned off on my phone, and my day's going like, oh my gosh, this thing happened. Oh my gosh, and it's like, oh my gosh, I need to shut that down because I want to spend more time in that mindful space. It is a practice. Same with our prayer time, all of that, it's practice, practice. The more we do it, the easier it gets. I often think about, if you think about neural pathways in your brain, that neuroplasticity, we've all heard that term, neuroplasticity, the ability for the brain to rewire. And the example I often use is, if you think about a forest, the easiest way through the forest is the trail that's already been cleared. If we're trying to build a new trail, we have to keep going over it. Our brain keeps wanting to go back to the trail that's the easiest, right? When we're trying to build new neural pathways and new habits and new patterns and spiritual practices, it's like, okay, we need to keep trying this new trail in the forest and fighting that urge to kind of keep coming back to the easiest way through. But I hope that this image makes sense for you, to be present throughout our day and giving ourselves permission to give some of that busyness back to God, or giving ourselves permission to let go of some of those things. So I'm going to finish off with kind of the healthy habits and spiritual practices. We are a product of what we consume. That's media, that's social media, that's sugar, caffeine, difficult relationships, right? We consume all of that, and we are a product of what we consume. Do not underestimate the power of sleep, the power of getting a restorative sleep. If that's something you struggle with, I encourage you to look online. Lots of great things on sleep hygiene strategies. That is when our body becomes restored. Stay hydrated, follow a healthy diet, we know that. Engage socially with supportive friends and family. Be intentional about who you connect with. Be part of a small group. Friends of a faith background. I have friends of a faith background, and I have friends that are not of a faith background, and I will tell you those faith background friendships are so much richer and so much deeper. Exercise. We know exercise is really helpful. When our stress hormones are up, that cortisol is up. So exercise helps us to release ourselves of that cortisol. It gives it a place to go. It also helps to produce serotonin and dopamine, which are things that we find actually in antidepressants and anti-anxiety medications. So we can do that naturally through exercise. Meditation and prayer. Find scripture to meditate on. Great scriptures given this week, Psalm 55. What a thing to kind of read regularly and just feast on that. Gratitude journaling. Quite often when we think about journaling, we think about, dealing with all of our stresses of the day, but really we want to focus on, okay, God, where did you show up? What was good? The sun was shining, traffic was light, got a text from my kids or whatever it might be. Just really seeing where God is in our lives and recognizing and acknowledging and praising him for that. I encourage you to challenge the critical inner voice. When that little voice is on your shoulder telling you need to do better, that's not from God. Challenge it. One way to do that is say, okay, if my friend was thinking that, what would I say to them? Chances are you wouldn't be as critical of them. So giving yourself permission to let some of that go. Spend time with God outdoors in his creation. Be aware of triggers. If you've been through trauma or you know that things trigger you, say, for example, you've been in a car accident at a certain point in the 401 and you get triggered when you go through that area, have a plan. Maybe it's some music that you're listening to. Maybe it's a scripture that you're reciting. Maybe it's doing some deep breathing. But just being aware of those triggers and developing a plan. Don't let your physiological response be your compass. If you've experienced trauma, you can't trust it. It's just ready to fight and flight all the time. So recognizing that when those symptoms happen, okay, I know what that is. It's okay. Let me just do my deep breathing. 20 minutes, it will pass. Right? Learning to tolerate that. Self-compassion. Having compassion for ourselves, as God has had compassion for us, is really important. Like I said, we often extend that to other people, but we're not so good at doing it ourselves or for ourselves. So I think just recognizing that God's love is pretty amazing, and he's given us permission to use it on ourselves as well. And if shame and blame is something that you recognize has been a pattern, whether it was taught to you by parents, grandparents, whatever that might look like, giving yourself space to say, yeah, you know what, that's not from you, God. I know that's not from you. That's not your voice. And really working on those elements as well, because like I said, that can keep us stuck. I want to just kind of highlight a couple of books that I like. They are not of a faith background, but they can be very helpful when dealing with some of these specific topics. This one is by Gabor Mate and Gordon Neufeld. It's called Hold On to Your Kids. Talks a little bit about kind of how we've lost that generational wisdom and support that is so important for our children. When we look at our children and our teens, it's like, okay, where is their support coming from? Who is guiding them, right? And how do we, maintain that connection to our children in a time that it becomes increasingly difficult? What Happened to You? This is an Oprah Winfrey and Bruce Perry. So it's about conversations on trauma, resilience, and healing. So it talks a little bit about her trauma experience and kind of the biology in the brain. This is a workbook that goes with it, and it's just to kind of do our self-reflection. So there's chapter summaries, and then kind of looking at what are the things that we can do to work on our own trauma. Gabor Mate, The Hidden Cost of Stress. So basically, it's when the body says no. So looking at really what does cortisol do to our body when it's long-standing. And it's amazing to me. I was like, okay, I think the research is still relatively new on the impact of stress on our physiology, but he's a leading expert in that area. The last two, The Body Keeps Score. This is really around those childhood memory pieces where the body remembers. Lots of people I know have read this book of faith background and of non-faith background, and I found that really helpful. And then this last one is a workbook, Dialectical Behavioral Therapy for anxiety. So strategies to manage working with stress, worry, and fear. So next Monday, so not next Monday, this coming Monday, Monday, May 1st to May 8th, is Mental Health Week through the Canadian Mental Health Association. The theme this year is My Story. What does that mean? It's really being curious about your story. Why do we function the way we function? Why do I react when my husband calls me by my name? Where does my resilience come from? Where has God shown up in my story? What have I been through? How do I celebrate and reframe some of that? It's not about laying blame or finding fault. It's really about trying to understand why we respond in certain ways. Be curious. Why do I study or struggle with self-regulation when I'm triggered? What are my triggers? So hopefully next week or over the coming weeks or even at some point, just to recognize and like I said, be compassionate for your own story and what you've been through. And look to see how God can support and maybe do some healing work if that's part of that, or where God has shown up and really brought you through some of those circumstances. And that is all I have. So thank you so much for coming today. I hope this was helpful on some level. Hopefully it, I don't know, I find with this topic, it makes sense to me. It really is like the body, yes, this makes sense why our bodies do what it does. So hopefully that was helpful for you as well. And I wish you all the best as you enjoy the last session of our conference today.